Hello everyone, today I'm going to come at you with a quick little review of Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's new book, Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. As many of you who have followed me for a while know that I am a bit of a fan of hers. She's a very interesting radical historian thinker, and she really documents Indigenous history well. One of her greatest works was, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, which I also recommend. But yeah, I went to see her talk a few weeks back and got her new book when I went to see her talk and got it signed. She's just a very, very interesting woman. And if you follow my channel for a while, you'll know about the anarchist book fair in San Francisco that was held at kink.com headquarters, which she pulled out of because of. So she's also a feminist. So I would also suggest reading her work for that. And there was a funny part of her talk when I went to see her when a man stood up and asked, there was a question and answer part. A man stood up and asked, why is it always men, committing these mass shootings? I think in the history, she really documents the history of mass shootings in the US very well. And yeah, I think there's been 2 cases of mass shootings that were female. And the truth is, mass shootings take place every day in the US. She also documents that. But it's often done as a quote unquote domestic dispute. Basically, these situations where men kill, multiple members of their family. And even in the Portland area, West Lynn, it's kind of a suburb area, very rich. There was a murder-suicide that happened recently. So this phenomenon of men annihilating their families is pretty much daily happening in the U.S. And she also very much addresses the fact that having guns in the house where domestic violence, male violence against women is taking place specifically, almost always guarantees death in the case of the woman being battered. So yeah, she really does address the multiple layers of the way gun violence and gun culture impact marginalized people in the U.S. She takes the position of being against the Second Amendment, which is a very radical position to take because even in most of the Democrats and most of the people wanting some sort of gun reform are always saying, I support the Second Amendment, but I support the Second Amendment, but without really analyzing what the Second Amendment was about, which was allowing basically for the continued theft of indigenous land through settler colonialism. The people think that the US government was, using troops basically to take over indigenous land. That shit was done by settlers. That shit was done by small militias of armed men taking over cultivated indigenous lands and communities that had existed for thousands of years in the North Americas. And specifically in the US, it was enshrined in our Constitution that they would have the right to do this because a big part of maintaining the social order was to allow people to basically have land. If they could take it, they could have it. But, it belonged to other people. And those people were murdered, those people were raped, those people were displaced. And are continuing to be to this day. So she really, because she is an Indigenous historian, she really details a lot of that and how it took place. She also deals with the creation of slave patrols and that history with the Second Amendment as well. So, there's multiple layers to the Second Amendment. We get a very sanitized understanding of our Constitution, as our education system is so warped and, basically all of the textbooks that we receive are, in the US anyway, are printed in Texas by conservative nutbags. So she talks about like how the NRA and like these really extremist right-wing groups have taken over, politics around most of the country because they have organized people at a grassroots level. And that's what's really needed. She calls for that to, challenge the gun culture. And she also talks about her own experience with guns. She's also a radical, and like one argument that's often stated for, the defense of the Second Amendment is that, especially by radically minded people, there are radical groups that arm themselves. And I'm not against that. But I think that's separate from the Second Amendment. There's a difference between having weapons for self-defense and weapons for because you can, and because they are tied to maintaining your power. And she really breaks it down, like the NRA and all of these different, big gun culture people. That she totally shows the connection between like the extreme white nationalist right. She really details all of that history and stuff. And we have to understand that the Second Amendment as it stands is a white nationalist, white supremacist law. It's a white supremacist value. And it's never been, the case that people of color in the U.S. or marginalized communities in the U.S., like Indigenous people, arming themselves has ever been met with anything but repression. So we have to understand who has rights to have guns. And it's white people, mainly. It's self-defense is one thing, and I do think that people who are oppressed should arm themselves if they need to feel safe. But that's a very separate thing from whether we should have a document like the Second Amendment in our Constitution. And she also breaks down the absurdity of the American Constitution, and like she talks about like how things changed in Australia, even though they did have an indigenous culture that was destroyed through a lot of the same tactics of settler colonialism and settler violence against the indigenous population. And they did have a gun culture of a lot of people owning guns. They were able to pass laws because they didn't have this kind of Second Amendment bullshit. So I think it's really important to start to challenge the Second Amendment. And I will say I'm very grateful that I went to see her talk and got this book and read it, because it's given me a lot to think about my own position on guns. Like, it definitely widened my perspective, because I had this very knee-jerk kind of radical response to like, well, I support, arming of the proletariat, which I do. But we have to understand that the Second Amendment and how gun laws operate in the U.S. has nothing to do with self-defense or like arming oppressed people. It's portrayed in that way, and like, oh, we need to keep ourselves safe from our tyrannical government. The U.S. government could easily crush all the fucking people that are stockpiling weapons like psychotic freaks, your arsenal is not going to compare with that. Like, what's needed in the U.S. for change is grassroots organizing. You have to change people. And yeah, you should defend yourself if you have to, but like, let's separate these things and let's attack these white supremacist institutions like the gun lobby, like the NRA, like the whole like gun culture itself, and the Second Amendment. And let's really think about the U.S. Constitution in its historical context. Like, why are we beholden to this thing that doesn't really apply to modern life, and the West has been conquered pretty much. The whole continent has been fucking conquered. So like, why are people still amassing these weapons? I mean, there's really no one left to displace and kill. It just seems absurd. And like, we all have to live in this like fear constantly of being shot, by some rando. Like, anyway, she also breaks down like who a lot of mass shooters are. And of course they're male, but they're also specifically males with histories of domestic violence, with history of misogyny, and she even details some of the mass shootings that were taken place directly because of men's misogyny. There've been several in the US and in other parts of the world too. Obviously Canada, there was the Montreal massacre. So anyway, yeah, just a quick review. I love this book. Gave me a lot to think about. Her writing is impeccable, and the history she details. She does not detail things from a United States history perspective. She details it from like a human perspective, so you get a full context, and I really appreciate that as well. I mean, it is the history of what happened in this land, but it's also like a history of you know, the people who were harmed by these laws, mainly, you know, the African slave population, and later on the free black population, and of course the First Nations people on this land. You know, they're the ones who've bared the brunt of what this law was about, which was basically allowing white militias and gangs to control these populations and terrorize these populations and kill these populations. So yeah, definitely recommend. Definitely 5 out of 5. And also she's just an awesome feminist and historian and just everything. So you should support her work. So yeah, check this book out if you're interested in this stuff. I really got a lot out of it. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. So I will see you all next time. Maybe do a viewer request video. I've got a few. Thank you to those who sent those in. If you like this video, please give it a like. If you like my content, please make sure you're subscribed. If you really like my content, consider becoming a patron. And of course, check out the links in the low bar to connect with me elsewhere. I will speak to you all very soon. Thank you.